Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Tierney. I'm really excited to be presenting my first practical cartography day today. I wish I could be there with you all, but excited to talk to you about how to edit your own maps. So in my presentation today, I'm just going to go over a few simple tips and tricks that can help you edit your own maps, whether you're working independently with a small team or want to fine tune your mapping prior to sharing with an editor, manager, or client. So one of the first best practices I'm going to share with you all is hierarchy. So hierarchy is really important in that you want to focus on what is the one thing or multiple things that you want your reader or your audience to take away from this map. I would argue that even a trail map has a lot of elements at the same level, will have some level of hierarchy. So obviously you've got roads, trails, et cetera, that need to sit at the same level. But one thing you'll notice with some trail maps, or at least I've noticed, is that cities or towns nearby pop out the most. They're often bolded, or the first thing you see kind of to orient yourself, whether you're driving to a trailhead or you need to drive from the trailhead elsewhere. And so fine-tuning the hierarchy of your map can help make your map more approachable, so that there's not too much information hitting the reader all at once, and help communicate the message you want to be the most prominent on your map. Maps are abstractions of reality. So a map, it's impossible to include every feature of the landscape. Even satellite imagery, you could argue it hides a lot of things. And so they're really abstractions. It's like a snapshot in time. And it also is, on the cartographer side, you're picking and choosing what you want to include in the map to help the reader and also to highlight a specific feature. So each element should have an element of reality that's the most important for you to communicate to the reader. If we're at the Washington Post, we want to communicate an area that's closed along the National Mall. On a trail map, you want to more communicate where trailheads are or important features along those trails. And so when you're making the map and when you're editing the map, you want to pick out that feature and really make the element pop. And so to walk through some of these best practices I'm going to go over today, I've put together this sample map. So this is a map. There's nothing wrong with this map. There's nothing inaccurate about this map. The one thing I did notice after I made this, though, is Independence Avenue should be southwest, not southeast, but that's the only thing I could spot. But essentially, this map, it shows the reader's roads, parks, water, points of interest, and it highlights a closed area along the National Mall. This map's purpose is to highlight that closed area around the National Mall. And so this map has all the features, and how do we change these features to make that one prominent element that we want the reader to see most, that area closed, pop on the map? So the first thing that we're going to do with this map is we're going to start messing with the background to have it set back. So for this first step, what I did is I pulled the roads back. I pulled them to a very light gray versus the dark gray that they were before. But one thing you want to be careful of is when you drop back something in the background, you also want to make sure it doesn't get too lost. So when I pulled these roads back, I lost the roads on top of the National Mall. And so to fix that, I did multiply of those lines. So they're still faded back, but the design of them is adjusted slightly just so that they're still visible, but not completely lost in some areas, especially over the river where the bridges cross and over the National Mall. But we can adjust the background further. So for that first example, we adjusted roads. The next step is adjusting some of the background fill features. So this map, the background fill consists of, you've got land, you've also got the parks, so the National Mall, Theodore Roosevelt Island, and you also have the Potomac River and the tidal basin. And so taking some of those elements and setting them back. So the water is still blue, the parks are still green, but we pulled those back to a lighter color than they were before, just so that they sit back, and it's going to later hopefully help the area close pop a little bit more by pulling both the roads and now the filled in areas back. The next step we can work on with hierarchy, now that we've pulled back some of these background elements, is improving the visibility of and the hierarchy of the feature in the map that we want people to see first. So in this case, that's the area closed, as I mentioned before. And before it was a bright yellow, which it does highlight it, but there are ways that we can highlight it further. So changing the color so it stands apart more from the background map. In this case, I went with a bright orange. Depending on the topic, depending on the theme, you could change it to different colors. And I also made that line thicker, and I also took the label, the area closed label, and bolded it so that it is more apparent. So I've adjusted the background elements to sit back, and I've also worked with the element of focus to pop it up. So it's kind of like a give and take where you want to be moving back and forth through elements as you progress with your own editing. And so in the next step, I want to bring some of those background features back further. So before I had a lot of these labels um, as black, and not all of them need to be this prominent. Right now, I would argue that the street names actually pop up more than the area closed. And so I want to pull all of those back. So what I did is I grabbed all the labels and I set them to a dark gray, just enough so that they're visible, but they're not overwhelming to the map. You could argue that these could be varying shades of gray. I think for a map like this, bringing them back to one color is a little bit simpler of a route, but there are many ways to adjust this to help with the hierarchy. And then one other adjustment. So we already adjusted the parks and the rivers, but taking another look at this, the land feels quite saturated for and conflicting with some of the elements. And so another step going back to the background. So it's a little, again, it's a little bit of back and forth when you're self-editing is, does this work? Yes, for now. But as you change other elements, you almost need to re-edit as you go. So check in, like, I changed this before, is it still working now? I didn't change this before, is it still working now? So it's always good to kind of back check that. And so in this case, I just lightened the background color and brought that back a little bit more. So now you might be saying, Lauren, like, your labels are a bit busy, they're a bit all over the place, which is why we're moving to label placement as our next, as our second best practice for when you're self-editing. So label placement can really help with clarity on the map. It can help people better understand what features you're pointing to, what features are in reference. These are some general best practices for label placement we go by at the Post. There are many sources for this. This one is derivative of Ken Field's book, his cartography book. But these are just some of the best practices we go with at the Post. And so if we return to our map, there's a few things we can see. So a lot of the road labels are running over the tops of streets. One thing we can do is we can shift those. So in some cases, I actually removed the road if that was too busy and if it didn't make sense to reference. And essentially, I moved the roads. In most cases, I move them above the line so that they sit on the line, kind of like those best practices I highlighted before. For the example of Independence Avenue, it actually sits below, and that's because it is more visible there than it would be in the National Mall area on the green where there's no other street labels. And so just being consistent with what the street labels sit on, because I am able to do that for this map case. So the road labels aren't running over the top. Another thing to adjust while editing is your point label placement. So as those guidelines I showed earlier, oftentimes what's labeled as like the first place for map label placement is that top right corner. Well, the top right corner is great, but it doesn't always work, especially if it's starting to conflict. So the White House previously, and the Washington Monument, and also the Capitol building, those were highlighted in crossing over that area closed, which disrupts that main area of focus. And so going off of those principles of first, second, third, best placement for points, I've adjusted these slightly just so that they fit a bit better within those area closed. And so I'm not interrupting that main line of focus. And then the others, like Lincoln Memorial, just kind of tighten up that label so it's not filling up a big majority of the western part of the National Mall. And so another adjustment, just shifting the labels just slightly so that there's a bit alignment between them. And then also in this one, using the base colors to help identify what colors the label should be. So if you look at Theodore Roosevelt Island and Potomac River and Tidal Basin, I've changed those labels rather than a dark gray, which again is fine, but to help them sit back a bit more. So we're working with labels, but also going back to hierarchy. So as we go through, like a lot of these best practices for self-editing, they connect to each other. And so having the Potomac River Tidal Basin set to that blue, it helps tie it a little bit more to the water feature. Also the Potomac River label, have labeled that along the river so that it feels more tied in with the natural feature of the river running along that edge of DC. And so those are just a few more label edits there. And then one other adjustment looking at this map previously is making the street labels smaller. And so it's an adjustment to labels, but it's also an adjustment to hierarchy. I felt like those labels were very busy. I felt like they were distracting, especially they're very long street labels. And so it's one of those things where I felt like they could sit back a bit more. And so I brought them back about a half point size, just so that they're there for reference, they're legible, but they're not overwhelming to the map and have that area closed pop a bit more. The third best practice I want to go over is halos. And halos are something that, whether you're working web map, trail map, or maps for journalism, or really any project, halos can really help the legibility of your map. So these are some of the best practices for halos that we go by the post. There's a few options we try. Sometimes it's an outline around your text. Sometimes it's a blurred shape or outline around the text. Another good thing to do is to have that halo match the background of the map that you're working on. And one thing to watch out for is that the halo is not too close to the color of the text that you're working with, or it doesn't match the background in the example of that last option. And so halos, they make a very, very subtle change. So this is our map as we last left it without halos. And this is the map with halos. And it's very, very subtle. You might not even notice a difference for most of them, especially like the Lincoln Memorial Capitol building. But it does, if we go back and forth, if you look at the Capitol building label, you really see it just pop a little bit more. And it's not that we're lifting up in hierarchy, we're just making more legible. So if someone wanted to know, hey, am I going to be able to access the Capitol? For say this is for 4th of July celebrations, you'd see, oh no, like there's the Capitol, it's in that area closed, like can't go there. And so even those background labels are important to have legible as well. And so here's with the halos. And also one thing we did is added halos to the area of interest itself. So the area closed and the area around it added a white outline, which is technically just a second stroke, but you could consider it a halo in that it's making it pop a bit more from the background. Same with that area closed label as well, as adding that white outline kind of helps make it more prominent. So we're using halos to in turn help our labels have better hierarchy. So again, these three self-editing practices can really build upon themselves, and it's a lot of back and forth. So I don't recommend going like dealing with hierarchy, then dealing with your labels, then dealing with halos. Is really like kind of give and take with all of them. Work on hierarchy for a bit, then work on labeling. Once the labels change, go back to hierarchy. And really, you can do this endlessly. You always have to have a stopping point, but doing a little bit of back and forth between these three best practices can really help self-edit your map before you send it to your manager, to your editor, or to your client if it's a freelance project. And so our map has been edited, our map has been cleaned up, and we can consider this done, send it along. One thing I recommend though is taking a break from your map. So you go through your checklist, going through hierarchy, labels, halos, doing a little bit of back and forth there, and take a brief break from your map. Sometimes you might have a day, sometimes you might have a couple days, sometimes you might just have like a coffee break or tea in the case of sometimes at the post when we're working very fast. And so even a brief moment can help just take a break from the map and come back to it with fresher eyes to give it one last edit, looking at these three principles of hierarchy, labeling, label placement, and halos to increase legibility. And so here's our map where we last left it. We've addressed these three best practices for self-editing, and let's do a little bit more editing. So I took a step back from this map, came back to it, and I had a few edits. So one thing, either digitally or on paper, if you have the opportunity, is it's really helpful to mark up your map. And so for this one, I just marked it up. So one thing, I felt like the scale bar in the bottom right corner was really busy on top of that highway. So move it up to the top right corner where there's not really much going on. I found that the symbols for the White House, Lincoln Memorial were quite busy. They kind of detracted from that area of interest, and I didn't quite feel like they needed to be exact points because really at this scale, they're kind of bigger areas. And so I marked those as I want to get rid of those. I want to label those in the area. And then another edit that I came across was, well, that area closed, it's a bit hidden on top of the green for the National Mall. What if I adjust my label placement so that I get that area closed label a little bit more visible? So this is just taking a little bit of highlighter, editing, doing a little bit of self-editing, and then here are those changes in practice. So those those symbols on the mall are removed. I've used the label in place of having the symbol and the label, which for things like the Capitol building, it really does take up a lot of space. And so that does generally make sense. For the Washington Monument, you could argue that might be better as a point. But really the main thing I'm trying to communicate is these features are within this closed area. And then having that area closed above, I would argue the reader's eye is going to hit that before it gets kind of muddled in the National Mall polygon. And so here are our two maps side by side. So we've made this journey, and on the left is where we started, and on the right is where we ended up. And something I really encourage when you're doing self-editing is take screenshots of the process so that you can see, a lot of these changes are very little and very subtle, but they all build upon each other in the self-editing process. And so when they build upon each other, it's nice to keep a record so that you see like, wow, I did like these tiny little tweaks and it really made a big difference. And so I recommend taking screenshots when you can, when you have time, just to kind of see how things change and improve. And sometimes they might not improve and you might want to go back to a different version. But I think it's a huge confidence boost to see like how your map progresses. And of course, like you don't just need to rely on yourself to edit as well. I mean, it's a really great practice, and I highly recommend it before sending your map to a client, to a manager, to an editor. But also rely on the people around you. So coworkers, friends, neighbors, even a parent if they're visiting and you're curious about like, oh, does this map make sense? Getting your map in front of just a few more people will help you determine, does this make sense? Is the thing I want to standing out the most, or something else popping up instead? And so obviously some people don't have this ability. If it's a particular work project that can't be shared, in that case, self-editing is a really helpful skill. But it can also be helpful for other projects, even when a lot of eyes are on it, just to kind of help get it a next step further before other people are giving it a full edit. And so I just want to thank you all for your time in this presentation, and I hope everyone has a wonderful NACIS. Thank you.